This episode of Tech Indie Learnin is brought to you by the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc.
Heritage is a road paved by our ancestors. It leads from our past and guides us for the future. Today, we explore Bay Street. So come, let me Tech Indie Learning.
Hello, I'm Karl Watson, retired senior lecturer in history and archaeology at the University of the West Indies.
I'm Zoena Perry-Willett, and I'm a lover of Barbadian history, and today an eternal student ready to Tech Indie Learning. Now, I've been given permission to call Dr. Watson Karl, so I'm going to take full advantage of that. And Karl, our topic for today is Bay Street. I'm very excited to explore this with you. So, I know Bay Street as this low-key party vibe. Has it always been that way?
No, Bay Street actually has a fascinating past, and I'll tell you, we often think that our history began in 1627, and we ignore the fact that for 5,000 years before, people were living here in Barbados and exploiting the resources of the sea and having to move from point A to point B. So what is Bay Street today was originally a footpath that ran along the sliver of beach that covers the whole or encompasses the whole section of Carlisle Bay.
Okay.
And that footpath actually ran down the west coast through Bridgetown, which back then was a mangrove swamp, and continued along what is Bay Street today, and took you around then to the south coast of the island. The Amerindians, of course, they weren't people who were fixed in one position. They were highly mobile people, mobile in their canoes and mobile on feet as well. So when the settlers came here then, they took advantage of the fact that there had been a clearing made in the heavy vegetation that lined the coasts of Barbados. And so wherever there were previously used foot trails, footpaths used by the Arawaks of Barbados, they then turned them into like primitive early roads, and eventually then most of the early road system of Barbados derives then from this mix and utilization in the 17th century of previously existing trails used by the Amerindians. So the point that I really want to make in all of this is that our history can't just be compressed into the last 400 years.
Right.
It goes back way before that.
Now, Bridgetown, that area would have been settled around 1640. Did Bay Street come into its own around that time?
Again, interesting question there. The core of Bridgetown, and Bridgetown was settled in 1628, 1630, that core is the area around St. Mary's Church. If you were like to use a compass and draw a radius of several hundred yards, that was the core of early Bridgetown. So across the Constitution River then, across the mouth of what became the Carinage, what is now Bay Street was a later developer. So Bay Street really is a development of the late 17th and early 18th century, when things like, okay, today, a main adjunct of Bay Street is the pier head. And the pier head was the key location for arrivals and departures from the island, even when I was a child. And you were going by schooner or boat to other islands, or people crossing Atlantic in steamships, their point of departure was the pier head. But the geography of the Bay Street area, Carlisle Bay area, has been changed, and largely by human intervention. So where the pier head is today was actually a series of exposed reef at low tide, etc. And in the early 18th century, the townsfolk of Bridgetown were instructed to take all their garbage. It was like an early landfill, if you like. Really? And so that was built up. And then what became the mole head that then changed the designation to Pierhead. That developed then, as I said, the principal point of entry and departure from the island and the principal point of exports. Again, you're too young to remember this, but in my early years, the Careenage was a bustling, active place, and so was that part of Upper Bay Street. There were warehouses. This is where sugar, molasses, rum was exported. The Careenage was full of lighters because there was no deep water harbour, and ships would anchor in Carlisle Bay, and then the goods would be rowed out to the ships, so that you had lighters that were rowed by lighter men skilled. I mean, I look back to my memories and I think, my goodness, how could 2 or 3 men so capably manage these large wooden craft, heavily laden with hogsheads of bags of sugar, hogsheads of rum, etc., and take them out to the steamships in Carlisle Bay, where then it would be transferred into the hold of Carlisle Bay. But as I said, the Careenage and that upper part of Bay Street was a hustling and part of the later commercial development of Bridgetown. As Bridgetown grew and expanded then, the whole character of Bay Street started to change, and there was that commercial area that then transformed into a residential area. And I'll tell you, I come from Culloden Road, essentially the Bayland, and so my early childhood was often when we were taken to swim on what was a tiny little sliver of beach. And for most of its existence, Carlisle Bay and Bay Street then there was this symbiotic relationship between the sea, what the sea produced, what the sea enabled you to do, the livelihood that the sea gave you, and the people who lived in that immediate area.
So for you, seeing as how you have lived near to Bay Street the majority of your life, how have you seen the changes? What's the biggest change that you've noticed with Bay Street?
Well, yes, there again are important questions, and there are a number of changes. First of all, the geographical change, because, as I said, Bay Street is intimately associated with the sea, and of course we immediately think of the beach. And we think of what is today, arguably, I would say, one of the top 5 most beautiful beaches of the Caribbean. The entire sweep of Carlisle Bay now is ringed by a fantastic beach. When I was a child, that beach did not exist at all. Where there's the Esplanade on Bay Street, as a child, if I went, I had to be very careful. When you went to the edge of the Esplanade, you looked down onto big rocks that had been placed there because the sea, when it was raging, would come in, and you couldn't go too close to the edge because the waves would break against the breakwater of the Esplanade, and you'd get soaking wet. I mean, I remember after Hurricane Jeanette, in the late evening, we went down to see all the damage and so on, and we walked through the upper part of Bay Street onto the Esplanade and looked at the sea, and it was incredible because waves weren't just coming in an orderly progression. Waves were breaking from the 4 points of the compass, and they'd hit together, and there'd be like a geyser going up in the air with the force of the waves left from the fury of Hurricane Jeanette. So that beach that has developed there now augurs for an even greater transformation of Bay Street. But I don't want to get ahead and get into that transformation now. I want to make one essential point about the development of Bridgetown and the important role that Bay Street played, and more importantly, the Beccles spring of fresh water that flowed into what we now know today as Browns Beach. And again, when I was a child, it was still an active spring. The big Beckle Spring had more or less been curtailed, and it hasn't dried up, but it's gone underground. But associated with it, a bit further up, where the yard of the Bay Estate, because remember that Bay Street, which gets its name from Carlisle Bay, was also the main, well, acreage or geographical encompassment of the Bay Estate. It was a sugar growing area. So I remember hearing stories from my mother that between Beckles and Chelsea going down to Bay Street, sugar still grew there. When I was a child, the mill wall for the Bay Estate was still there. It's been demolished since then. And the old boiling house, that had just fallen in, but it had a slate roof. And as children, we'd go and pick up pieces of the slate and write on. But then to get back to Bay Street immediately, why Beckle Spring was so important is this. For Bridgetown to develop where people lived permanently, wherever there's human habitation, there's one variable that has to be filled, and that is access to potable water. If there's no water, people are forced to be nomadic. They can't set up permanent settlement. So Bridgetown had a number of springs and ponds, but the most important source of water, both for the people of Bridgetown and for the huge quantity of shipping that came into Carlisle Bay and anchored just off of Bay Street, was the knowledge that they had a permanent, heavy flowing, I forget how many gallons of water a minute, but it was a major source, the major source of fresh water for both the inhabitants of Bridgetown and the shipping that came into Carlisle Bay. And now that I can show you where that spring is, and it still exists. I mean, plants respond to underground sources of water. And you can always look at a species plant and say, hey, there's water underground just under the surface. Otherwise, that particular species plant would not grow there. And the type of reed that grows in that area. So the spring has gone underground. But again, I can tell you, and as a child, this is sort of a delight. When we went down across Bay Street and went down to Browns Beach, a little sliver of beach, as soon as you went into the water, you could feel cold spring water bubbling up and bubbling between your, it actually tickled your feet, you know, as it bubbled and came up. And you could go, put yourself on the water and open your eyes and look, and you see all these bubbles of fresh water coming up all the time. And if you wanted to, you could go down to the source and actually drink fresh water. It was really quite remarkable, you know. So that source of fresh water was, as I said, the real genesis of the development of Bridgetown and the development of that ribbon development of housing that ran the whole length and breadth of Bay Street.
Now, I have heard that cholera would have started in the Bay Street area from a spring. Is it that same Beckle Spring, and how did cholera spread?
Yes, again, a tragic demographic issue and incident in Barbados' history. 1854, a ship coming down from the Virgin Islands. There was an outbreak of cholera there. And of course, cholera is a bacterial disease, and it's spread very rapidly by bad bathroom habits. You don't wash your hands, etc. And a sailor had died on board the vessel. Clothes were expensive back then, so his body was committed to the deep, but the dead sailor's clothes. And cholera presents with acute vomiting and acute diarrhea. And so his clothes were very dirty, but teeming with cholera bacillus. And washerwomen at the period would row out to the boats in Carlisle Bay. They earned a living by getting the dirty clothes of sailors and washing them in the spring, cleaning them, and then returning to the vessels and be paid. And this washerwoman, you can imagine, she has all these clothes washing. She doesn't realize that she's washing her own doom, that her life is about to end and the life of her children and the entire village. So you can just, as I said, just imagine this. And she's, as we say, like jerking the clothes against the rocks and so on. And then she gets tired and her hands, she doesn't know, nobody back then knows that there's such a thing as bacteria or viruses. So she picks up her hand, filled teeming with bacteria, wipes her forehead, wipes her lips, and she then becomes a carrier of cholera.
Just like that.
And she goes back home, and late that night, she develops a roasting fever. By the middle of the night, she's vomiting and all the other things associated with cholera. By midday, her children are exhibiting the same symptoms. By evening, she's dead. By the following day, all her children are dead. In less than a week, the village is dead. And that's the epicenter of the cholera epidemic. And in 3 months, close to a quarter of Barbados' population, just over 23,000 people are dead of cholera. So many people are dead that mass graves have to be dug around the island and bodies are thrown unceremoniously. You know, on the other side of Bridgetown, where what would used to be the Spring Garden Highway, spring because it was a spring. A lot of people don't know, but there's a huge cholera burial ground there, and over 5,000 people rest, thrown in unceremoniously in this huge hole in the ground that we dug out, and dead bodies just thrown in, because thousands of people were dying on a weekly basis, and their bodies had to be disposed of. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point, because springs, as I said, were the givers of life, the creators of life, but in that particular incident in our demographic history, that spring was also the doom bringer, the bringer of death, and death too. As I said, a quarter of our population. You know, you can fast forward. Suppose COVID that we just went through had been as great a killer as cholera was in 1854. Can you imagine what Barbados would have been like if close to 100,000 people had died on our island within a 3-month period? I mean, it beggars the imagination.
I'm here in shock just thinking about the sheer numbers you were talking about.
Well,
and that was back then. Our population wasn't as dense as it is now. So.
No, not as dense.
Yeah.
But people, both in country districts and in the greater Bridgetown area, were dying, as I said, thousands at the peak. Thousands were dying every week. And you can imagine the terror, the horror. You know, so many people were buried alive.
I've heard this.
Yes, that there was actually a scheme done, and you would tie a piece of string around the supposed dead person's hand and attach it to a bell that was suspended on a piece of wood, so that if the dead person woke up and found they were in a coffin, they could pull the string, and if anybody was passing by and heard the bell ringing, they would know to get a shovel and come and dig up the coffin quickly. But that was in the early stages of cholera, because later on, so many people were dying that you just couldn't, there weren't enough coffins to bury people, and so just bodies were thrown unceremoniously, dead or not dead. Would you like to hear a gruesome story?
I am always for a gruesome story, to be honest.
Well, this is a story that I heard growing up by my great-grandmother. Now, just up the road from Bay Street. So it's not a Bay Street story proper, but it's an interesting cholera story. Down Hardscap, there was a fairly well-to-do family. But men with push carts would go wrong, and they were like paid, extra paid danger pay, because they were in charge of collecting all the dead people, throwing them on the push carts, and taking them to a mass burial pit, which was just on the Hastings main road. And so they went to this house, and they call out, of course, in rank Bajan, wait, nobody in there answering. We're all we wanna bring out the deads. We here waiting to take the deads away. And no answer, nothing came up. And so the man raised his voice, hey, one in there, come on. So one of the men said, nah, you're wasting your time. I go in the house and look and check and see what's happening. So he went in and he called out, man, you can't believe this. Everybody in here dead. So they said, come, let me take out the deads quick and put on the push cart. So they took out all the dead people. But the lady at the house, she was actually in a coma, and she woke up.
Wow.
And the men in the meantime had looked at her hand, and in those days there were no banks, so people had money. They bought jewelry, and her immediate cash was converted into jewels. So she had some gold chains on her neck and some rings with jewels on her fingers. So the men were pulling the rings to get them off.
Oh my gosh.
And what really woke her out of the coma, on her little finger she had a wonderful gold ring with a diamond or an emerald or something like that. But she was a corpulent woman, and they couldn't pull the ring off. So one of the men got a knife and started to cut off her finger. And that woke her up out of the corner. And so she said, good there. When I could take the ring, but I when I don't cut off my finger, do. And the man said, what? You play, you living? Hush him out, do. We taking off your finger, they said, we taking the ring for myself.
What?
And they proceeded to finish cutting off her finger, and they took all her gold and everything.
That's crazy.
She went down there, and to put in again in Beijing, they skin out everybody down in the hole in the ground with all the other dead people. And of course then you had to throw white lime on the bodies. So the woman was down there, and I beg, wanna take me out? Hush him out. And they threw the white lime on her, and that was the end of her.
That's a different time for her.
And I will tell you, we, as children, you're enthralled by things that frighten the living daylights out of you, but you want to hear them. That was one of our favorite stories. Tell us the story about the woman during cholera and how the man cut off her finger.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. That's their bedtime story. Now, as we go back to Bay Street and exploring Bay Street and what it's become now, how do you think that Bay Street in the future is going to be?
Well, Bay Street is going to change radically. Now, I've been privy to have seen some of the plans for Bay Street. I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but the plans have been laid. Again, and this is due to the accretion of sand and the creation of that wonderful, wonderful beach, Karl Bay, which I repeat, it's one of the top 5 most beautiful beaches in the Caribbean now. So the plan is, now, in the short run, regardless of how we feel about tourism, in the short run, tourism is the engine that maintains our quality of life, our standard of living. Now, I have lived long enough to see radical changes. So the Barbados I grew up, I grew up, we were not well off, we were poor. I grew up in a chattel house with a mother and father and 7 children in a small wooden house. Life was difficult. Well, life was difficult for everybody around. And we didn't live in a throwaway society. If you had a pair of shoes, you treasured them, because you weren't likely to get another pair of shoes, Money had to be spent very carefully. But tourism has distributed money, given money has percolated down, perhaps not as well. The trickle-down effect has not been as marked as many people would like it to be. But certainly our lives have been transformed by tourism, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there are all these aspects of tourism. But the powers that be, the planners, those who look to the future and decide what our economic path is going to be, etc., the decision has been taken, from what I understand, to radically alter the streetscape, the landscape of Bay Street. And where now there are small structures, houses, etc., there are plans to put up high-rise hotels. So I think, I speak subject to correction, but from the last plan I saw, I think there were 5 major hotels planned for the Bay Street area. And then again, I understand, and you can seek vindication of this, clarification, whatever. I understand that the possibility exists of the rerouting of Bay Street. So I understand, for example, that the area where the geriatric hospital is sited, for example, I understand that may be slated for demolition, and the government headquarters, and where the government headquarters is today, there's going to be a large conference center built there.
Heritage helps us decide where we're going by learning and growing from all that has been passed down to us. So, join us next time as we tech in the learning.